1944, the Battle of Normandy had finally resulted in an Allied victory. The long, bloody struggle to break out to the open countryside of France and Belgium was now underway. As this occurred, a serious problem was being created. The supply lines that fed the large army of all their needs became badly stretched due to the long distance where the armies had landed and now to where they were. Hundreds of miles had to be covered by men with supply trucks to get equipment, ammunition, food, medical supplies, gas, and everything else considered vital for operations to the front. It was a bittersweet problem for the Allies. The advances they made were beyond their expectations, and keeping it going would be the issue. It soon became clear that a second port was needed urgently. The main and obvious choice was the Belgian port of Antwerp. Its deep water entry for large ships was perfectly suited to handle any amount of commercial shipping. The port had over 20 miles of waterfront docks serviced by over 600 cranes, and it could handle over 900 ships of various sizes at one time. And unloading 40,000 tons of supplies a day was not a problem. The problem was the Germans held it and knew the importance of defending it. So basically at this point, everything from June till this time was being brought in from Normandy on these huge truck convoys. And now they'd just simply gone too far to keep up with their armies, and they needed a point B now to resupply them. Now, if the war was to continue in the Allies' favor, the port must be captured intact. And Allied Supreme Commander General Eisenhower recalled after the war in his memoirs that it wasn't necessarily the port itself that would be the most difficult to capture, but rather the approaches that led to it, termed the Scheldt estuary. It was a very accurate prediction in late 1944. The port of Antwerp was located 80 kilometers inland from the North Sea coast, and these approaches that led to it were lined with German fortifications, including large naval guns that could destroy any size of Allied ship trying to enter. The 15th German Army occupying the area was over 90,000 strong and had been ordered to fight to the death by Hitler. The operation to seize the port began on September 3rd, and General Montgomery ordered the British Second Army to advance and capture the port from German hands intact. The operation was surprisingly only lightly opposed. The British, along with the Belgian resistance members, took quick control, and on September 4th, the next day, it was fully in Allied hands. The next job would be up to the Commonwealth troops under the command of Lieutenant General Guy Simonds to secure the Scheldt estuary. The Canadian General Harry Currier had been initially given this order, but due to a severe stomach illness, he was removed from the theater and sent back to England for treatment. This automatically put Simonds in the top command position. Under Simonds' command was the 1st Canadian Army, which was 5 divisions, 2 armored brigades, and 175,000 men, 2 British divisions, a Polish armored division. In total, Simonds had over 400,000 men under his command. It would be the largest amount ever for any Canadian general to command. This amount of net manpower would be needed because the terrain in Holland and Belgium easily favored the defenders. The wet marshlands in the south impeded movement, and the 3 large islands at the tip of the estuary could be easily defended and were turned into fortresses. The 15th German Army, although unbeaten, chased by the Allies through the campaign for Antwerp, was still a formidable fighting force. They were also aided by the pause the Allies took during Operation Market Garden in 1944, which we've been exploring this week. Market Garden took valuable resources away from the Allied planners who knew the Scheldt was a bigger priority. The failure in this strategy gave the German troops the time to further fortify the area. If I had not attempted the Arnhem operation, said Eisenhower, possibly we could have begun the Scheldt operation some 2 to 3 weeks earlier, especially when better weather was going to be required as well. Now, on October 2nd, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division marched north from Antwerp towards South Beveland, a thin strip of land that connected itself to the first island. They soon met German resistance 4 days later. The German troops took high ground on top of the dikes that surrounded the estuary and caused heavy losses among Allied troops who fought from the low and open flooded lands. Resistance varied from light to fanatical. Casualties were mounting on both sides. The Canadian troops from regiments all across Canada fought in conditions that would later be described by General Montgomery as uninhabitable conditions. Canadians soon realized they had been given one of the least glorious missions of World War II and received little to no press attention as all eyes were on the advance spearheaded towards Germany. The situation soon became worse in what would be known as Black Friday, October 13th. Blocking the entrance to South Beveland was the small town of Woensdrecht. Acting as a cork in the bottle, the town was heavily defended by German paratroopers as a 6th Parachute Regiment. These were high-quality troops between the ages of 18 and 26 years old, and in the defense of Woensdrecht, the majority of the fields around it had been flooded knee-deep by the Germans in an attempt to slow the advance. But 3 different Canadian regiments would face these paratroopers in a desperate struggle for control. The Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, the Black Watch from Montreal, the RHLI, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and the Fort Garry Horse Battalion from Manitoba. Now, Woensdrecht itself, the battle would open with the Black Watch on October 13th. It was given the code name Operation Angus. The regiment earlier that same year had taken horrendous losses at the Battle of Area Ridge in Normandy on July 25th. They suffered over a 97% casualty rate when they assaulted the western portion of the ridge, which was one of the most heavily defended positions in all of Normandy. 325 men were killed or wounded in 45 minutes. Only 15 men answered the roll call the next day from that regiment. They were just totally decimated. And that was Operation Spring, as they called it. The regiment had to be reformed and now found itself 3 months later in another extremely difficult position. Their orders were to assault the village in a flanking maneuver to take the left to the high grounds overlooking Woensdrecht near the railway lines. The Germans had dug themselves in a crest to confuse any and all movement from below. The attack began late in the morning, preceded by an artillery barrage and a smoke screen to protect the troops from German sight. Men slogged their way through cold water and mud in what resembled a World War I battle. Initial gains were accomplished, however, as the regiment proceeded to their objective, as the smoke screen faded and the artillery lifted, the new replacements of the Black Watch were about to receive their baptism of fire, as the fellow comrades did in the wheat fields of Normandy. German machine gun fire began to rip through their ranks as they became easy targets caught out in the open fields with no place to protect themselves. German mortar fire began to rain down on them, causing further casualties. A 1,200-yard open field became the second graveyard for this regiment. Soldiers tried to employ smoke grenades to obscure themselves, but had little effect in the large area. To make matters worse, the Germans laid mines and booby traps in the field, causing many more injuries and death. As the Allied commanders watched through binoculars from a distance, they witnessed the regiment being totally decimated for the second time in less than 90 days. The proud regiment from Montreal's only mistake was following orders that bordered on suicidal. In the muddy water-soaked field lay 183 men, 56 which were dead, and a further 27 wounded were taken prisoner. All 4 company commanders were killed. The Black Watch had been foolishly devastated once again. The regiment suffered one of the highest casualty rates in World War II, second only to the units involved at the Dieppe raid. Now, when this attack failed, General Simmons took a different course of action. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Dennis Whitaker, who had also been at Dieppe, would be given the job of capturing Woensdrecht 3 days later on the 16th. This time, the attack would commence at 3 a.m. under the cover of darkness. Much more artillery and tank support of the Fort Garry Horse was brought into the battle as well. Whitaker's men entered the outskirts of the town and began fighting house to house to gain control. Many personal hand-to-hand battles took place between Canadian and German soldiers in the dark of night. The fighting continued for 9 hours when the message was sent back that Woensdrecht was in Canadian hands. The Germans had retreated from the town. The victory was short-lived, however, when the same paratroopers holding the high ground against the Black Watch 3 days earlier counterattacked the next morning. 1,500 fanatical troops crashed into the village outskirts in a close-quarter struggle to regain possession of the village. The fighting at times was so intense that Whitaker himself called in an artillery strike on his own position when he and his men were totally surrounded by German paratroopers. And if you ask a soldier what that means at that point, you've basically committed yourself to be killed in action. You're calling in your artillery run on top of you. Whitaker incredibly survived the incident with many of his men around him by taking cover in basements of damaged houses. The Germans suffered badly caught out in the open. The Shermans of the Fort Garry Horse engaged targets in support of the Rileys, as they were nicknamed, who held on desperately to their newly gained ground. 3 exhausting days later, the Germans gave up their counterattack and retreated from Woensdrecht. The Hamiltons' losses were similar to those of the Black Watch, 167 casualties in 3 days of fighting. The Germans suffered over 480 and 50 taken prisoner. One of those prisoners, a German officer, when interrogated, spoke about his captors. He says, "We understand the Yanks, and we know how the Limeys do things." He says, "But you Canadians aren't fair." He said, "You darken your faces, you attack at night, you use flamethrowers all the time, and yell and scream." He says, "It scares the hell out of my men." I always found that an interesting quote from a prisoner of war. It was perhaps a very accurate testament as to how effective the Canadian fighting man had become. The battle for Woensdrecht was over, and now it opened up the door for a bigger advance into South Beveland. The cork had been removed from the bottle. Woensdrecht, however, would forever be etched into the memory of the men whose regiments fought there. It was one of the many battles fought in the overall Battle of Scheldt, but it remains one of the most costliest for Canadians in Holland. Canadian troops would eventually go on to secure South Beveland by the end of the month in Operation Vitality Offensive. The Battle of the Scheldt would continue on until November 8, 1944. Many other names of the battles will be written into Canadian history books. Places such as the Leopold Canal, Breskin's Pocket, Kapellschweer, where Private Lobenstein fought, the Walcheren Island, and Bergen op Zoom, to name a few, saw Canadian soldiers fighting and dying in the cause for freedom. The clearing of the estuary and the approaches now meant the port of Antwerp was available for use. After all the mines were cleared in the water, the first Allied ship sailed into the docks on November 29th. It shortened the supply route to the front lines by over 500 kilometers. The cost, however, was large. During October 2nd and November 8th, the 1st Canadian Army suffered 12,800 casualties. Canadian troops made up half that total. 7,600 Canadian soldiers lost their lives fighting in Holland. The rest, they're arresting in 3 major cemeteries that we have all been to. The Dutch population has never forgotten the sacrifice of so many young and brave Canadian soldiers who left their home thousands of miles away to fight for people from another country they didn't even know. It created an unbreakable bond between the two countries that is evident today that we have seen this week. So we're going to go into the town here, and we're going to see the monuments that have been erected representing the 3 regiments that fought here on those 3 days in October. And we're going to take a good look at this, and I'm going to explain another story coming up about some of the particulars of this battle here as well. I was talking to Glenn here, one moment please, I was talking to Glenn about this in depth here, and we were mentioning something. He found a quote from General Montgomery after the Battle of the Scheldt directed to the Canadians. And this is what he says right out of his book. The book is titled Corps Commanders. And he says, I want to express to you personally and to all the commanders and troops in the Canadian Army my admiration for the way in which you have carried out this very, very difficult task given to you. The operations were conducted under the most appalling conditions of ground and water, and the advantage in these respects favored the enemy. But in spite of great difficulties, you slowly and relentlessly wore down your enemy resistance, drove him back, and captured great numbers of prisoners. I congratulate you personally. That's from one of the top Allied commanders in the Army. Thank you, man.